Good evening, everybody. Glad you took the time out of your day to click on and hear the latest thing that I have to talk about. If you tuned in on Tuesday's Facebook Live, I can tell you that this one's probably going to be a little more upbeat than that one. I was just in kind of one of those moods, that sometimes losing a friend puts you into. But anyway, I want to tell you a story, and just to give you a little background of this story, I read this story this morning, and it really hit me. We've learned from stories all of our lives since kindergarten, since in my day it was C-Spot Run with Jane and Dick, and so we've kind of grown up listening to stories and learning from stories. Hey Joyce, thanks for tuning in. But this story, it was really interesting to me. But usually when I use anything, I try and find out more about it, like where it came from, who wrote it, some of the background of the story. This one is one of those that nobody knows, and it's been told several different ways, starting with, I think, a Buddhist monk or something, way back. But anyhow, it doesn't make any difference how you tell it. The point of the story is still the same. So I'm going to tell you about a CEO, a retiring CEO or an elderly CEO of a company that he had built, put his life in, and invested his entire being into this company. Knew he was getting older and that he needed to pass this business on to someone that would take care of it. So he set out to find his successor. So he called in all of his young executives into this big meeting room, and he told them that it was time for him to step down and he was going to choose the next CEO. And he said, "This is how we're going to do it." He said, "I'm going to give each of you a seed today." And he said, "This is one very important seed. I want you to plant the seed. I want you to water it. I want you to come, be vigilant in taking care of it, nurture this seed. And in a year, we're going to come back and see what's growing out of your seed. And I will know, based on the plants, who the next successor of my company is going to be." One man named Jim that was there that day, and just like the others, took his seed home. He planted it, he watered it, he took care of it every day. He was excited. He told his wife the story, and of course she was excited at the possibilities. So she helped him get it all together, and every day Jim would water this plant. He'd watch it to see if it would grow, and after about 3 weeks, nothing was happening. Not even a sprout. So the other people in this group began to talk about how their plant was growing and how great it looked and all this kind of stuff. And Jim felt kind of bad because his wasn't doing anything. He kept checking his. A month went by, 5 weeks went by, still nothing. I mean, it was just not doing anything. Hey Marvin, thanks for tuning in. So 6 months goes by and still nothing. He just knew that something he had done was wrong and that he'd killed the seed, and everybody else's trees were growing and their plants were growing. And Jim just quit talking about his. He was very embarrassed that he couldn't get this seed to grow. But he kept on. He kept watering, he kept fertilizing. He wanted this seed to grow so much. And finally the year passed by, and the CEO was going to have everybody come back in. And Jim told his wife that he just was not going to take this empty pot in because it was just too embarrassing. Everybody else's plants had been thriving, and here he couldn't get his plant to grow any. But his wife told him that he should be honest about it. She said, you should go ahead and take it in there and just face up to it. So Jim walks into that meeting that day, and he's carrying his little pot that has nothing growing out of it. And here's all these other young up-and-coming executives sitting around him. And all of their plants grew. I mean, they were just beautiful plants. All the people around Jim started to kind of whisper, you know, and they were really feeling sorry for Jim because he hadn't been able to grow this seed. And in walked the CEO. He looked around the room and he said, man, he said, you guys have got some great looking plants. He said, the trees that you've grown, the flowers are beautiful. And he said, and from looking at all your plants, he said, I'm going to pick a successor. But then all of a sudden he saw Jim back in the back of the room standing there holding his little pot that didn't have anything growing from it. And he sent his financial director back there to get Jim and brought him up to the front. And he asked Jim, you know, Jim's expecting that he's going to look at this pot and fire him for not growing anything out of it. But he looked at Jim and he said, what happened to your seed? And then Jim told him the story. He told him everybody else's plant was growing, and he just kept watering his and kept trying, and he just couldn't get it to grow. So the CEO asked everybody to sit down, and except for Jim, he said, Jim, I want you to stand here with me. And everybody sat and got quiet. And the CEO looked over at Jim and he said, here's your next CEO. And he's pointing at Jim. And everybody in the room, I mean, their jaws dropped because Jim's plant did not grow. It just was a pot of dirt. And they couldn't understand, you know, and they started kind of mouthing in between them about how could this happen? This is not fair. How could he make Jim the CEO when he hasn't grown anything and I've got this big plant? And the CEO told him, he said, a year ago, I gave every one of you in this room a seed. I told you to take the seed, to plant it, to nurture it, and to come back here in a year. But he said, what you didn't know is I gave you a boiled seed, meaning that he had basically killed the plant, killed the seed. So none of them would have grown anything. And he said, and I look around this room and I see all of you that have plants, and he said, I know that all of you got another seed to plant in your container so that you could impress me with that. He said, Jim is the only one out of all of you that was honest about it, came in here and faced the music, and showed me that he did exactly what I asked him to do and got the results that I expected him to get. He said he's the one that had the courage and the honesty to bring me a pot with my dead seed in it. So he said, here's your next chief executive officer. Because Jim had the honor, he had the integrity to face the things that were coming before him. He had the honesty and the integrity, the courage to stand before that CEO on that day of reckoning and say to him, I wasn't able to do anything with it. Unknowing to Jim, that's exactly what he should have gotten. And that's what I want to talk to you about tonight. I want to talk to you about integrity. You know, there's all kind of cute little sayings around. One of them, I'm trying to think who it's attributed to, and I'll probably think of it later, but it says, Integrity is doing the right thing when nobody else is watching. The dictionary defines integrity as the quality of being honest, having strong moral principles, and moral uprightness. And then it says the state of being whole and undivided, meaning that it's kind of like the yin and yang concept in Taoism, where the two halves complement each other, and if those two halves are out of sync, then everything's out of sync. So integrity is the one virtue that people look for in a person. And I think it's probably because it's so rare. You know, we live in a day, and it's not much different than any other period of history. It has nothing to do with the political climate or anything. But we as humans have kind of always been, what's the word I want to use? We take shortcuts. Instead of doing the right thing all the time, as the saying went, doing it when nobody else is looking. A lot of times we tend to cut the corner a little bit, and we'll do like some of the others did, and we'll, instead of taking in no plant at all, we'll take in a seed that we bought ourselves. Socrates said the first step to greatness is to be, in reality, what you appear to be. Think about that for a minute. To be, in reality, what you appear to be. All of us, those of you that are watching and those that are going to watch this replay, you are probably thinking right now either of an incident that you might have not had the integrity, or someone else that you knew didn't have the integrity that they needed. And this whole concept of integrity is universal. It doesn't matter who you, what part of the country you came from, what your background is. Isaac Newton's third law of motion says that for every action there is an equal and opposite reaction. In other words, whatever you do, there's going to be something coming back at you. In the Bible, Galatians 6, in verses 7 or 8, I think, it says that we get that idiom that all of us know that says, what a man sows, he shall also reap. And then the Buddhists have a concept of karma, which is basically the same thing. A few years ago, there was a very funny TV series about this guy that won a lottery ticket and got run over before he could, or got hit. He didn't get completely run over before he could cash the ticket in, and the ticket was gone. And he saw that as karma, and he set out to make right everything that he'd ever done to anybody. And that's basically karma, is whatever you sow into the world is going to come back to you. So if you sow good things are going to come back. If you sow bad things are going to come back. It has nothing to do, in my opinion. Now, I'm certainly not a minister or a man of the cloth or any of that, but in my opinion, it has nothing to do with God's punishment or reckoning. It's just a natural law that flows. If you put it out there, it's going to come back to you. Integrity is something that cannot be taught in school. Integrity is something that you learn either by your parents or some adult influence in your life. But no amount of schooling, no amount of training can teach you integrity. It's kind of like you either have it or you don't. The other side of that, though, is that sometimes if you don't have integrity, life is going to teach it to you. Just like the story that I just recited to you. If you and the interesting thing about that, I was thinking about this as I was making my notes. All of those people in that room that saw Jim being promoted to the CEO probably sat there and said, "This is not fair." And they're talking to each other. Jim doesn't deserve this. I raised this plant and all, and they. Or they'll say the CEO wasn't fair, selection process wasn't right or whatever. They will grumble. And you know these people as well as I do. They're the ones that, when anything happens to them, rather than step up and say, well, I just made a bad choice. They're the ones that blame everything. They blame where they came from. They blame their mothers and dads. They blame their priest, their preacher, their school teachers. They'll blame everybody except for themselves. That's the difference between a person with integrity and a person without integrity. A person with integrity will accept responsibility for what they did and the consequences, because there's always consequences. This is a life lesson that I try and teach my granddaughters, and they grow tired of hearing Papa talk about, doing the right thing or whatever. But there's always consequences. The interesting thing about consequences is that even though people know that, even though they logically understand that if they do bad, there's going to be a consequence, but they don't accept the consequences. They blame the consequences on somebody else. And that's where the integrity kicks in. I think that probably one characteristic, if you could isolate all the characteristics that we as human beings have or could have, I think integrity is kind of like the fulcrum. And if you're not familiar with a fulcrum, picture a teeter-totter, the old teeter-totter in the schools. It had a centerpiece, and whichever side had the weight, that's which way it would go. Well, this center spot was the fulcrum that tipped that. And I believe that's what integrity is in a person's life. It's that one thing that tips everything in either a good way or a bad way. And a person with integrity tends to have things fall in their way. And that's why you see people that are they just seem incredibly lucky. But I don't believe it is that. It's because somebody somewhere along the line has seen the fact that they have this quality in them, that they are honest, they're upright, they do the right thing. Doesn't mean they're perfect, because we can't get there. But it does mean that they try to do the right thing all the time. So I want you to keep this in mind, because it's a vital thing. Doesn't matter if you are the CEO of a company or the janitor of the company, or the lowest person on the totem pole. Integrity is something that will multiply things for you. If you're familiar with the law of attraction, it's kind of like the integrity factor is the additional magnetic pull to good things that will come your way. If you plant honesty, you're going to reap trust. If you plant goodness, you're going to reap friends. If you plant humility, you will reap greatness. If you plant perseverance, you'll reap contentment. If you plant consideration, you will reap perspective. If you plant hard work, you will reap success. If you plant forgiveness, you'll reap reconciliation. if you plant faith, you'll reap a harvest. So be careful about your integrity. Guard it, protect it, cultivate it, because it's a seed that you may not see a lot of growth out of at any one given point. But I can guarantee you, to tell you in a different frame of reference, and this is going to be really quick. Brenda and I used to have two boys that lived with us as foster kids years ago, and they were of a different culture than we were. They'd been raised different. They lived different. They were kids right off the street. And I was talking to my brother-in-law, who was a family counselor at that time, and I was just kind of telling him that, I don't really see a lot of good that we're doing. We're taking care of these kids, but they don't want to be there, and they kind of go against everything that we do from time to time. Not always. They were great kids in the whole. And he said to me something that stuck with me, and it's stuck with me ever since, and it's kind of fashioned or formed a lot of the things that I do. He said, you may never know the effect that you're having on these two kids. And I have seen that so many times in my lifetime. In those two kids, by the way, I think we did have a lasting impact. And they saw us as somebody that you could trust and somebody that would do the right thing for them. And I think in many ways they've got that lesson, regardless of whether it was enforced after they left our care or not. But I want you just to think about this integrity for a minute, and I want you to consider the things that you do. If you're the guy or gal that's working on the most menial task at work, don't cut corners. Don't cover up things. Keep it out in the open, because somebody's looking at you. It could be one of your coworkers. It could be your boss. Somebody is looking at you, and they're watching what you do. As the one idiom that I've used many times, I'd rather see a sermon than hear a sermon. And that's exactly what you do when you practice integrity. So keep this in mind. Whatever you give to life, life is going to give back to you. So if you want good things in your life, do good things in life. If you want to be more, do more. If you want to have more, do more and be more. So I hope this has made some kind of sense in your minds tonight, and I really am very passionate about this, because it's something that we lack as a human race. Not completely, it's just there's not enough of it around. So I want you to be that other person that goes out tomorrow and do the right thing. Every time something comes up, if it's going to get you in trouble, hey, own it. If it's yours, own it. Be responsible for it. Be the most honest and most forthright person that you know how to be. Practice integrity. Show it to the world, and those good things will come back to you. I hope you enjoyed watching this one. I'll be back next Tuesday night with another episode. Next week, we're going to be dealing with habits and what habits we need to have, what habits we probably need to get rid of. And the hardest thing about it is how to develop good habits. So both of my Facebook Lives next week and my blogs are going to be dealing with building habits. So if you If you've got a habit you want to break, or if you've got a habit you want to put into your life, tune in next week, Monday for the blog, Tuesday for the Facebook Live, Wednesday for another blog, and Thursday for a Facebook Live. And I hope you have a great week. I hope blessings come your way, and I hope your life is fabulous. See ya.